Morning everybody, Simon Dixon here. I have been going on live on Twitter all this week and want to mix up the format a little bit. Now I'm inside rather than outside. It's been a beautiful week all week. And today I'd like to talk about a topic that was asked in the comments and of one of my previous live streams. Which is somebody asked if I could share how I very first discovered Bitcoin, how I first got in, and the story behind that. So I'm just going to share that with you and go into a little detail about my very first Bitcoin, when I first discovered it, and why it, how and our journey to getting involved. Just before I do that, I'd like to, if you'd like anything covered in a future broadcast, then can you just let me know in the comments below this video? I'll pick up any comments, any topics you'd like to see, anything to do with the financial system, how to navigate it, anything to do with crypto, anything to do with Bitcoin, and any other topics that you'd like me to cover off in future live broadcasts. I'll try and cover whatever is most relevant at the time, and at the same time I'll try and mix it up with some different topics from the history. Like I have been all this week. So without further ado, I'm going to take it back. I guess my journey started before 2006. 2006 was actually when my first career was as a stockbroker. Then I got into market making, and then I was working in corporate finance at investment bank called KBC. I decided to leave in 2006. At the time I decided to leave to discuss about these words weren't the words at the time, but now I know what the words are, but systemic risk in banking, the financial crisis, and the unsustainable nature of the financial system. And I joined a little very niche movement at the time, and it was called the monetary reform movement, the banking reform movement. And monetary reformers believed that the nature of how money was created was going to drive a real problematic financial system and eventually the systemic collapse of the entire system. The word financial crisis wasn't really a mainstream term until we had the issues in 2007. And so I was giving lots of talks around the world, educating people on the nature of how money is created, talking a lot about how banks create money, how banks own your money, how banks can spend your money, and how that creates crazy risks within the financial system that eventually are going to implode. So it was very much the background I came from. By education, I was doing economics. I mastered at the University of Manchester, and really kind of disagreed. At the time in my economics, it was really the classical theory of economics versus the Keynesian theory of economics, and then a very small side topic would be things like Austrian economics. And monetary policy and monetary theory was really based upon many incorrect assumptions about a multiplier effect and the fact that you have like this base of money that the central bank creates, and then they control it at the base and through interest rates and inflation, and all these topics were taught from a very traditional and so it kind of gave me the background to actually question some of these assumptions and look at some of the alternative schools of thought and alternative money. So that was really where I came from when I discovered Bitcoin. Then I decided, I was blogging a lot. I'm going to try and revive my blog, actually. It's got lots of those old posts from back I think I first started blogging in 2008, the same year that Satoshi Nakamoto released the white paper. And then I got a bit more active in 2009, and the blog I was using was called simondixon.org. Crazily enough, don't worry, I've still got the archives. It was on a WordPress blog, so I can put it back. But I managed to accidentally, recently, I think it was this year, let the domain name expire. And so I think someone else has got the domain name. but I'll find another domain to put the blog up again so that the archives are there, because it's an important part of how I got into crypto, how I got into Bitcoin, and is good to see there. It wasn't until around about 2010 that I started to go live on more social media mediums. So up until then, it was very much offline and doing offline talks, and it wasn't until 2010 that I really started to get into the internet. My first introduction was blogging, and then discovered things like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and various other things around about 2010. Now, at that time, I decided that I'd written a couple of books and just a few blog posts and various other papers. But I decided I wanted to write a published book. And a publisher picked me up called Search in Finance to write the book. And the book was called Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust. And it was really designed to be an introductory, very easy to read, accessible book to achieve a few goals. Educate people on the financial crisis and the challenges ahead, but also give people an idea of many of the reforms that are happening, both at the bottom-up level by companies that are building financial technology, and also at the top-down level, what government reforms we need to see in traditional fiat currencies in order to get to a more sustainable banking system. I did not know it, but at the time, while I was researching in 2010, I got a Facebook message from a guy called Johnny Bitcoin. And Johnny Bitcoin was, I think, his Twitter alias at the time, and he was part of this monetary reform movement. And he sent me a couple of videos and a couple of links about this thing called Bitcoin. And he was extremely excited about this thing called Bitcoin. And he told me that he'd moved into a squat in Old Street in London with some of the very early Bitcoin developers and a guy called Amir Taki, who was a bit of an activist and really pushing for Bitcoin at the time in the UK. At that time, I lived in the UK. But then, moved to Hong Kong and different places over the time. But a lot of the early stuff was happening in the UK, and across Europe. And so I looked into this thing. It seemed like a really interesting topic, so I checked out the white paper, and I decided that I was going to include the topic in my book. So I spoke to Johnny Bitcoin a bit more. And he told me that he'd actually sold his house, moved into a squat, sold everything and put it all into Bitcoin. This was, I think this was it was either about $1. I remember there was a big run when it went up to $1 and everyone was celebrating. And then it went from $1, I think it pumped up to $30. And it was somewhere around that time that he decided to put all of his everything he had into Bitcoin, and he was extremely bullish about it. So I was really intrigued, and I started to look at it a bit further, and because I was writing the book, Bank to the Future, I decided to include it in the book, Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust. It was so small at the time that it wasn't really something that could make a whole chapter, but it was included as an alternative monetary system that was being developed, that actually has some of the sustainable principles I was talking about, and a really interesting thing. So as far as I know, that book was the very first published book in the world that included Bitcoin. So then I was speaking with my wife, and I introduced her to this concept of Bitcoin. And at the time, we were actually dealing with regulators trying to apply for a banking license because we wanted to create a non-fractional reserve bank. Dixon had this idea that we'd spent so much time trying to educate people on the issues with banking, and the interest was very low until the financial crisis. And so she came up with this idea that we should create our own bank that operated off the principles that we believed. And that was giving depositors the ability to own their own money, giving depositors the ability to dictate the flow by having some transparency in how the money is lent or used. And also do it where we don't create money when we issue a loan. And we wanted to just demonstrate how a future bank could actually look like. And we started speaking with regulators, and it was very, very challenging because regulators were saying, well, you can't actually create a bank that doesn't operate off the fractional reserve system. And you're going to need to have a chief executive from a bank, and you're going to have to do this in a very traditional way. So that was very disappointing for us and very disheartening. So we decided that we wanted to pull our money together because Amir Taki and a couple of other people were organizing the very first Bitcoin conference in the world in Prague. Prior to this, there was one in New York, and I think that attracted many of the early Bitcoiners like Roger Ver and Jesse Powell from Kraken. They were probably, and many other people, but we went to the one in Prague that was organized by Amir Taki. And in Prague, the community was approximately, I think there was no more than 50 people at the conference. I remember first meeting Max Kaiser at that conference and Stacey Herbert, who were the first journalists in the world to cover Bitcoin on television on the Kaiser Report. There was also a gentleman I met there called Tony Galippi, who was pitching a startup, which later became BitPay. The speakers there were very, very geeky, very computer science based. I came from a non-technical background. I was more from a finance background. I gave a talk, which is a little bit, I don't know, it's not my best talk. If I had understood the importance of, Bitcoin in my life prior to attending, I think I would have given the talk a lot differently. But it's in there in the YouTube archives. If you want to search for that, in YouTube, search for Bitcoin Conference 2011 Simon Dixon. That should get you to a video on YouTube, which was uploaded like several months later when the recording came out, where I gave a talk on, really some of the work that I was doing and how Bitcoin was an important part of that. Really this was our main introduction. We were so inspired by the people, both the technologists and the other people that were at this conference, that my wife, Bliss Dixon, was completely blown away. We were completely blown away, and it just happened to time, it was very serendipitous, the timing, because we were having all these challenges with our vision of trying to create a bank, being told that it was not possible to create it, finding out about this thing called Bitcoin that essentially had created a bank in a box, and you didn't need any permission in order to build on top of it. So someone came up to me, and they were selling this physical Bitcoin. It was called a Casacius coin. I think they got shut down in the end because you can't create physical money, and it was a very uncertain regulatory environment at the time. But essentially, they were taking these physical gold coins, and they were printing off a holographic private key where you had to peel it off, and then it actually had Bitcoins on it. And this was the very first time that we got, introduced to Bitcoin. Now, during the conference, the price of Bitcoin crashed to $3. So there was quite a lot of panic, but the community really didn't care about price then. The community really was computer scientists, technology geeks that wanted to change the world, and activists that believed that they could, an alternative financial system that operates outside of banking was what it was about. And that's what everyone was there for. Price really wasn't a topic of conversation. It really wasn't about speculation. It was about changing the world. It was a very, very mission focused conference, and incredibly inspiring, and a moment that changed my life forever. Bliss, my wife, walked away incredibly inspired and said, look, we've got to build, Bank to the Future on So we had a company, not just a book. We were going to call the bank Bank to the Future. We got to use Bitcoin. Bitcoin's the future. This is the answer to all of our problems. And so we started to kind of pivot the model around creating a financial institution where we could invest in a lot of the companies that were building around Bitcoin, and also facilitate the growth of a banking system that was built upon Bitcoin. That was the original vision. Obviously, things have changed a lot over the years. We've learned a lot more, but really it's all going full circle back to that original vision. We then were one of the first companies that started to allow people to invest in equity using Bitcoin. We just started to dedicate most of our efforts and stop focusing on trying to persuade politicians and bankers to change the banking system, and just decided that let's focus all of our energy into supporting Bitcoin, and let's use Bitcoin. Obviously, as an investment, did incredibly well, and we were incredibly grateful for that. We decided to dedicate everything around Bitcoin and Bitcoin adoption, and supporting companies that were going to build on top of Bitcoin, and investing in the infrastructure, investing in the ecosystem, and building more of a global model. So it was at this time we decided we got to, that what we were doing in the UK was not a global enough model, and so we decided to leave the UK and get more involved in the global movement that is Bitcoin. We've seen so many different things. Obviously, then came altcoins and different waves of people trying to disrupt and do competing things to Bitcoin. Then came things like the equity started to mature, and the venture capitalists started to invest in our industry, creating some valuation increases in many of the companies. We then saw, Ethereum come around, and people trying to develop tokens on top of Bitcoin, and people deciding to create Ethereum, which I remember almost went bankrupt. It was funded by the Bitcoin community with Bitcoin, and the price went through its 2013, 2014 boom and bust cycle, and Ethereum almost went bankrupt, but they just managed to get the technology out there. And then a few years later, that led to disruption in capital markets, where people started to create tokens instead of issuing equity. And that later led to things like ICOs. And now more recently, the regulations come in, and then there was the whole movement away from Bitcoin and over to blockchain. And if you look at some of my other streams, I gave a talk, I think a couple of days ago, on my Twitter feed about how this whole movement around the time about blockchain versus Bitcoin, and everyone moving away and trying to deviate their attention from Bitcoin. I think it was the banks defensively, because they first tried to ridicule us and just thought this was something to be ignored, and then they tried to own it by creating a new phrase that disrupted Bitcoin, called it blockchain. And then that started to work against them, because the only blockchain that actually worked was Bitcoin. And then everyone started to go off and buy Bitcoin, as I talked about in the previous stream, in that blockchain versus Bitcoin whole argument. So that's really, and then later, now things like securities tokens, and every single large company in the world, every central bank in the world, every government in the world, Facebook, large tech startups, Silicon Valley, everyone now joining the ecosystem, and now Wall Street trying to get involved with ETFs and custodial solutions and new trading exchanges. We're still at that infancy where at least everyone, so at that time, probably only 40, 50 people were actually, the community. And I do want to tell you one other funny story, which is what happened after the conference as well. So the conference was held in Prague, and it was very much, the hacker community. There were people that wanted to remain anonymous, and some people had were hiding their identity. And afterwards there was a hackathon, and so we thought, wow, we're in Prague, we've got to get involved and find out what's happening. We found this secret location, and in order to get to it, you had to actually log into this encrypted website to try and get a code, and then you had to go somewhere, and then you would get another encrypted code, and then you would end up in this building that I can only describe looked like a crack den. It was probably one of the most scariest moments that Bliss and myself had been through in terms of the look of this building. It was like an abandoned building, and then you had to go through all these different really horrifically underdeveloped, it just really did look like a crack den. You had to keep going through these different hallways, and then suddenly you got to a door, and then you had to give a proper knock on that door. And if you gave the right knock, then someone with a hoodie covering their face would come out and answer the question. And suddenly there'd be this room full of developers and people that were just building things on top of Bitcoin. They had a little hacked together vending machine. And I remember buying a Mars bar there for approximately a Bitcoin at the time, and being really, really excited about the fact that I just made my first transaction using Bitcoin, and you could actually use it to buy something. It was an incredibly exciting moment, and just a really, really interesting experience. So that was how I got into this industry. I've been hooked ever since, and what I found is that people that get into this industry, once they understand the impact that this industry can have, I've never found a topic that just consumes so much time, energy, and effort from people, and they call it the rabbit hole. Once you go down that rabbit hole, it really is the most exciting time in financial history, where Bitcoin, this tiny little experiment, this social experiment, built upon missionary principles, is actually now changing and impacting the largest and entrenched monopolistic interests in the world, and disrupting and creating, essentially Bitcoin now is regulating the regulators. Governments are dictating their policy, knowing that people are going to have an exit opportunity to exit their fiat currency into the alternatives, and therefore they have to create better policies in order to, prevent hyper Bitcoin adoption. Really, it's having this major impact on some of the largest and most power plays in history. Every central bank now has, an innovation department dedicated to trying to figure out what they're actually going to do based upon this. And the largest, most powerful people in the world are all meeting around this open source piece of technology that is causing so much disruption. And to me, I believe it's going to be, we're still at that infancy. Yeah, we've come a long way. When we first got involved, there was very few people that knew about Bitcoin. But now, at least everywhere I go, everywhere in the world, at least everybody has heard of Bitcoin. They still might think it's a Ponzi scheme or a scam or a currency just for drug dealers. But their perception will change over the years once they realize how it impacts their life and how it's creating this disruptive force. So that's my little story. Thank you, Johnny Bitcoin. Thank you, Bliss Dixon. And thank you to everybody that's been a part of building this ecosystem. Once you go into this, your life is never the same. It certainly was the case for me. I'm just extremely grateful to have been introduced to this at the right time, right place, been discussing the right topic. And, a little bit off topic, but sometimes you feel like there's a guiding force in life. I certainly feel like I've been guided, making the right decisions. Things that seemed like really hard decisions at the time, like leaving investment banking or talking about a topic that no one was interested in, or betting, on a different banking system, or even just deciding to, evangelize for this thing that led to lots of ridicule, lots of people thinking you're crazy. But I think it's all guided, and I think that, I'm just feeling a little bit grateful on this weekend for everything that's actually happened, and for the entire crypto community There's a lot of infighting, there's a lot of people out there to scam you, but if you push through all those things, we're here around a common goal and a shared goal. And one thing I think it would be a nice place, as I've referred to many archive videos, remember when you start getting too much into the infighting in crypto and this cryptocurrency versus this cryptocurrency, I gave a speech, I gave a presentation for one of the Bitcoin radio shows a couple of years back, and the final video worth looking at if you fancy looking at the archives as I share these stories. I think the video was called "Stop Bitching, Time to Start Working on Scaling Bitcoin" or something like that. But I was there after an interview on Bitcoin Radio, I think it was, with Jeffrey Tucker at the Anarchapulco conference. And this was during the heat of, the Bitcoin scaling debate and everyone fighting and all sorts. It was a pretty nasty period in crypto, but also one of the most exciting times as well. But I think it's a good place. Sometimes on weekends I have quiet moments of reflection, just to have gratitude for everything that crypto has given to us, gratitude for what crypto will be giving to the world in the future, and really just gratitude for being alive at one of the most exciting times in financial history. And I think that's a great place to end this broadcast. As I said, I'm going to really dictate this content based upon what people say that they like, what they'd like me to cover, and just so please leave a comment, let me know what types of things you'd like to hear, what content, and I'll endeavor to engage in that in the weeks ahead. Thank you.